Good morning and welcome to the fourth and final edition of the C4L series of webinars entitled Cloud from a Business Perspective. We're going to get started just in a couple of seconds, focusing this week on building your IT cloud and realising its value. Prior to beginning, we're going to launch a quick poll just to find out a little bit about people's level of involvement in cloud computing at the moment. So the first question I'm launching, and we'll launch another one later on during the webinar, simply is your organisation using cloud computing services at the moment? So it should be on your screen now, and we'll just give you 20 seconds or so to give us an answer to that. So it's looking like a reasonable split between people at the moment on this one. I tell a lie, there's far more people not using cloud than those who are at the moment. I'm going to close that poll in a couple of seconds, and then what I'll do is just give you the results of those. So at present, 60% of the participants today are not using cloud services, possibly why you've attended our webinar today. Right, moving on. As I mentioned, this is the fourth in this particular series, and we'll be drawing some conclusions from where we've discussed previously and trying to really round off the series. Before beginning, just a brief introduction as to who C4L are. We were founded in the year 2000 by the Managing Director, Matthew Hawkins. As you can read there, we've had some really quite substantial growth, and we provide data center services across multiple sites in the UK and mainland Europe, and specialise in co-location, connectivity, cloud and communications. Myself, I'm a technical consultant here at C4L. I specialise in technologies surrounding the data centre. Particularly my speciality would be cloud computing, and I currently hold VCP 5 or VMware Certified Professional 5 accreditation. As I mentioned, this is the fourth. The previous three are available on YouTube, and following this webinar, this one will be available on YouTube as well, so you can watch the whole season if you'd like. If you have any questions, by the way, going through, please feel free to drop me a quick question. You can do that privately or publicly so other people can see. We will be doing this in two different sections, the first section being on building your cloud, and the second section being on realising its value. So I will answer some of these questions at the halfway point and then at the end. So section 1, building your cloud. We're going to put a little bit of definition around initially, and this is part of what we've been trying to cover in the season, what we mean by cloud. There are a lot of different definitions, and there's a lot of confusion about what people mean. So we've got a couple here that we quite like. IT services without the need to buy or manage infrastructure, and delivers computing as a service rather than a product. So just puts a little bit of flesh on what we're talking about when we mean cloud. And we're now going to define the area of cloud that we're going to be focusing on today. And we're going to do that by looking at the SPI model. This is a model we've looked at in previous webinars, and it's very useful for defining exactly the level of involvement that your cloud provider is going to have in your infrastructure. So if we start moving from right to left, so on the far right we have software as a service, which is the S in the SPI model, and this is where the cloud provider has the full involvement in the stack that pertains to the service that you're taking. So we're going to be talking about things like Gmail or Salesforce here, where you have no involvement in the hardware that runs it, the platform, or indeed the software. You merely log in, access it, and utilize the software. If we move one across, we're looking at platform as a service, and these are going to be things like force.com. And on the far left-hand side, we're having a look at infrastructure as a service, where your cloud provider will be providing all of the hardware layer for you, the abstraction or the virtualization layer, and that element is removed from your ownership and your control, and then you build the other layers on top of that. And it is important always to have a look at this kind of model just to try and get a feel for what level of involvement in cloud you are going to be having and what type of services you are taking. This focuses on one of our previous webinars where we had a look at what type of cloud people will be taking. Now this refers to people who are taking the infrastructure as a service layer. But we're talking about here public versus private versus hybrid cloud. And to give you a definition for each one, I'll go through these. Public cloud delivers computing as a service rather than a product, whereby shared resources are provided over a network. So this is where all of the hardware resources that you're utilizing effectively are shared or virtualized for various different clients. Private cloud is infrastructure operated solely for a single organization, whether managed internally or by a third party and hosted internally or externally. So this refers to where the equipment you're taking is dedicated solely to your organization. It might be that some of the boxes are standalone and some of them are virtualized, but they are all going to be solely for your organization, and you may manage them yourself. They may be managed by your service provider, whoever that may be, and you may host them on site or externally, but all the equipment is dedicated solely to your organization. And hybrid cloud, infrastructure that combines a mixture of shared and dedicated equipment irrespective of location or ownership. And this is where you're going to have a mixture of dedicated equipment and shared equipment. And the reason for putting a bit of definition on this is, again, when looking at constructing your cloud, you want to have an idea of what level of involvement your cloud providers can have, but also who's going to have ownership of the various different components, and are there reasons why you need to have a look at these differing cloud models. And if we have a look here, this is just a brief diagram on the relationship between the three models. You've got public cloud and private cloud at the extremes of the diagram, with hybrid cloud in the middle, and then the reasons why you might look to move between them. So if you move from a private cloud towards a public cloud, so taking something in the middle, you may be getting increased resilience or increased flexibility or making it more cost effective. However, conversely, the further away you may move from public cloud towards private cloud, you may be getting increased security, increased control, increased performance. So it's looking where you need your cloud to reside within that kind of model for your organization's requirements. So we also had a look at, in this series, securing a cloud. Now, this is something that comes up quite a lot when I'm talking to various people about taking cloud services, and there's obviously still a little bit of concern and ambiguity around this kind of section. You need to have a look, firstly, as we've mentioned, on what type of cloud you're having. If you're taking purely a software as a service type service from somebody, you're not going to have a great deal of involvement in the security level. As we're talking about infrastructure as a service today, then you need to start having a look at whether you're taking a public, private, or hybrid cloud model. Then have a look at the ownership and the responsibility, which is the first point we've put here. Who is going to own all the equipment? Who is going to be responsible for the security surrounding that equipment? Have a look at the involvement of your cloud provider and ask plenty of questions of them. Are their staff vetted? If you're taking public cloud offerings, where is the data going to be stored? Is it going to be in the UK? Is it going to be outside? You may need to start thinking about whether you're going to be in accordance with any ISO or SAS certifications that you may have for security if that data is going to be stored outside the UK, for example. You need to, and this is most important, not just in security, but in all elements of it, take a consultative approach. Who is going to be taking responsibility for the various parts of it? What level of security is important at each of the various steps? And that sort of starts to tie into the last point on this page here, whereby what level of involvement in security and how important this data is may start to define the different parts of the cloud you may take. You may want to take an entire public cloud offering, for example, but due to being, say, an FSA regulated organization, you may have to have all of your data for a particular set of clients solely on one piece of equipment dedicated to you, in which case you have no choice. You'll need to start having a look at a hybrid cloud model. So we're going to have a look now at actually the physical components that are going to build your cloud. We've mentioned a few questions here that you do need to be sort of having a think about. What components physically will make up your cloud? Where will they be based? And this is quite an important one. Who will own them? Are you going to own some parts yourself and some parts by your cloud provider, or are they going to own all of it? And who's going to be responsible for the various elements for it? It may be that you take purely an infrastructure as a service service model and no management on top of that, in which case the responsibility for managing and patching your operating system and keeping that up to date is going to be your organization. You need to be thinking about these things and who is responsible. We're going to have just a little look here at, again, looking at some of the physical components that may make up your cloud. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but you can start to see very quickly, if you start building it from scratch, where you're going to be having a look at some of the things. We look purely down the server line here. Are you going to own it? Is it going to be dedicated equipment? Is it going to be shared equipment? And from there, there's various different components that can start to make up the different parts of your cloud. So you really do need to be having to think from start to finish about what different type of things you want when constructing your cloud. So just drawing to a conclusion the first section of this webinar now, guidelines for constructing your cloud. What type of cloud are you looking to utilise? What level of involvement will your cloud provider have? Who will be responsible for all security elements? And what constraints do you have put on you by other sources? This is not even beginning to be an exhaustive list of questions you need to be asking internally, but definitely 4 things you need to be thinking about, almost irrespective of the type of services you're looking to take. From here, you could probably expand and put another 20 questions under each one of those headings, and that's something you need to do very individually for your organisation. Alternatively, start looking at some sort of consultative services from your potential cloud providers. So before moving on to realising its value, I'm just going to open up, see if we have any questions yet. Oh, sorry, one's just literally popped up. Is bandwidth free between cloud servers? That very much depends how you set up your cloud service and who you're taking cloud services from. You should be able to take cloud servers that reside on their own VLAN, and therefore you can pass traffic between them, so all of that traffic effectively is internal rather than becoming internet facing, and therefore in theory your bandwidth between them should be free. I'm not going to go out on a limb and say that is for all cloud providers, but a lot of cloud providers out there will definitely be able to provide you that free connectivity between your servers, and then you only pay for any bandwidth that becomes external to that and becomes internet facing. A second question here, how does MPLS fit into this model? It depends really where you're looking to integrate this model into MPLS, if that's the type of networking you're utilising. What you are seeing in some instances is almost that cloud infrastructure is becoming like a standalone entity, which is sort of what we were having a look at with the free bandwidth between the servers, where you pass your traffic internally between those cloud servers you've got, if you're taking it as one cloud estate, and then any networking you may have then back to your office if you're utilising MPLS or VPLS, then starts to become your layer of connectivity as an internal set, and then you may start having your exterior internet-facing traffic separate to that. So you may have, for example, 2 or 3 satellite offices and a main office, all of which are connecting via your MPLS into your cloud services, and that is all effectively internal. And then you're looking at taking all your external, your internet traffic, going via some kind of firewalling and whatever other security measures you may have out to the internet. I think we've got one more question here as well. We've got, can I store a Microsoft Access database in a private cloud? In theory, there's absolutely no reason why you can't do that at all. As it's private, you're going to have, in theory, the complete control over that, so you should be able to set up those servers with the resources available that you require and guarantee the throughput of them. So you should be able to set up database servers to do that. It may be you can also integrate that into a hybrid cloud model. You may want to have some dedicated servers if they're very intensive database servers, and then have your other services, your web services and various other things sitting in public cloud servers, and you're going to get sort of the best of both there, where you're going to get the cost effectiveness and flexibility on those less demanding servers and the dedicated resources in your dedicated servers on that as well. I think that's all the questions for the moment. Right, if we move on to realising your cloud's value, the second part of this webinar. Realising the value of the clouds. It's something that comes up a lot. It's been a big motivator for a lot of people moving to the cloud. It's not solely about just saving money though. A lot of CFOs and people with a sort of commercial mind have seen it solely as this. It's wider than that. It's other qualities you can get from your cloud infrastructure that are not just money. Obviously, it is a big factor now more than ever, but we're going to have a look at sort of both sides of the coin here. So potential areas include acquisition of computing resources, upgrading of computing resources, and supporting of computing resources. So purchasing computing resources. The big one here, the one that people focus on most, is the ability to convert your traditional infrastructure spend from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. So instead of having to have a very large outlay initially, all of your services become a monthly fee. This is very useful for a lot of people. You can balance it quite often against incoming money to the business, and it fits in much easier. It's a lot less risk to the business having a large outlay in one go, and you can use the money for other operations that you want to use it. The other one here is not just also converting to an OpEx. It often becomes a lot cheaper for the same amount of resources, and that's really going to tie into point 2 here, because computers don't necessarily utilise the full resources you have on them. CPU overhead, often you have to get a far more powerful processor than you actually need for a lot of your resources. Also storage, you often get a much larger amount of storage than you initially require just because it's far cheaper to buy it initially, whereas you don't need to take that with the cloud. And this starts to tie into the second point we're going to have a look at here, which is the upgrade path, because you can upgrade as you go along. Point 1 here is quite easily relevant. As additional resources can be allocated dynamically, there is no need to upgrade in larger amounts than you require. So this means you can literally take exactly the computing resources you need day 1 plus maybe a 10% overhead just to allow for an initial bit of growth, rather than needing to take a far more consultative approach and look at a much bigger infrastructure set to start with, because it's cheaper to put it all in one go rather than having to constantly keep upgrading. It also avoids sweating the assets that we've listed here in point 2, because you can upgrade in much smaller steps. You don't end up compromising the resources you have because you've got to wait for budget to be allocated for you to be able to upgrade. We're going to have a look at that in a bit more detail here with the upgrade diagram. Some of you may have seen similar things before. If we follow the green line going across, that's your typical CapEx model, the traditional model really for upgrade infrastructure, whereby it was a very static upgrade path. You bought some IT infrastructure, it was more than you required initially, you got to a certain point where it wasn't quite adequate for what you wanted, and at that point you probably start asking for some kind of budget to be able to buy new resources. You then have to spec the resource and finally put them in, and by the time you've done that, you're starting to look at negative capacity, which is the shaded yellow point we've got here with the arrow, where you don't have enough resources to meet the demand of your organisation because the requirements have outstripped the resources you have whilst you've been trying to get that budget. The other thing you get, which is the green section there, is when you do upgrade, you initially go and you have excess capacity, but you have to upgrade beyond what you require to allow for growth. Therefore, you've got spend that you've put out that you didn't necessarily require. Lastly, having a look at the two sort of bits at the end where it tails off, or you have increasing demand and decreasing demand, cloud infrastructure will allow you to increase and decrease your resources in line with that to allow you to make sure that your estate always matches your organisation's portfolio. You may be reducing the amount of staff, you may be increasing the amount of staff, you want to be able to move in line with that far more dynamically. It saves money but also allows people to utilise the resources you want. And this is the other section to have a look at, which is not solely financial based now, is supporting your cloud. And it's not as simple as just the staff associated with it, it's also to do with the reliability associated with it. So the less support overhead is required because you're not necessarily having to look after all of the physical infrastructure layer. What you find in some organisations is that staff who this isn't really their core requirement and what they do day to day end up having to do it, and it can be outsourced and they can get on with doing the projects that they're actually employed to do effectively. It also saves a lot of time, as we mentioned here, not having to go to data centres to set up equipment, to manage equipment, to do your upgrades. This can all be done remotely. Your cloud should be able to be upgraded completely dynamically by your cloud provider, and your staff don't need to get involved in that. Lastly, also, you don't necessarily need to have a look at external consultants because it can all be provided without you needing to necessarily know everything about every piece of hardware that's involved in your cloud infrastructure. And as I sort of mentioned, the other part of this is the reliability of the cloud. You should be able to, with a reputable cloud provider, get access to enterprise level hardware that's set up minimum N+1 with high levels of RAID on storage, for example, but without necessarily needing to pay all the money to be able to take all of that. So it's often quoted as sort of enterprise level hardware at entry level pricing. The other point here as well is being able to look at DR or business continuity plans across multiple sites. Previously that would be quite expensive. You'd have to look at quite a lot of support overhead as well in managing network links between two sites and the equipment and managing how it was going to fail over. With a lot of cloud providers now, you can take services that will do all of that for you, and it's just an additional small monthly spend, so you haven't got to spend the time building, designing it, or managing how that failover is going to occur. So it can provide a lot of additional features and really add a lot of extra value to your organisation. So drawing to a conclusion sort of both the series and this webinar here, we've had a look at various topics and given you quite a few recommendations on various different areas. So when we were talking about security, when we've been talking about different types of cloud models. If we start to have a look at some of these in a far more broad sense, most of what you're looking at with building your cloud can fall into one of these sort of 5 categories here: price, performance, control, location, and ownership. Some of those are self-explanatory, like price. Obviously, most organizations have a budget to fit between, and that may determine some of what they take. Performance may start to impact on some of the different components you take. So as we mentioned earlier on, if you've got some very high-end database servers, you may want to look at some dedicated equipment for that. The level of control you've got, this may start to impact again. You may want to take some of it into the hybrid or private cloud models to retain more control. Location, which is becoming a far bigger one at all times, and this isn't just which data center they reside in, it could be which country they reside in. If you want to start complying with data protection acts and things like that for keeping data within the UK. And lastly is ownership, which ties a little bit into everything. Who is going to own the equipment, not just in terms of financially owned, but own responsibility for them and security responsibility. So you could, again, probably stick a lot of questions under each of these headings, but most of the things you need to be looking at will fit into one of those particular categories. Continuing, and quite a large piece of text here, throughout the series we've looked at a number of different aspects to consider when approaching cloud computing. We've offered guidelines that you should be asking both internally and of your cloud provider, or providers, as many people do take. Fundamentally, whilst we've given advice in all aspects, we have always recommended taking a consultative approach, and sadly have not been able to offer simple yes or no, do and don't answers. That's probably the most important sentence here, is the consultative approach idea. In every part of building, constructing it, whether you're engaging your own internal staff or your cloud providers, take a consultative approach. Ask lots of questions and don't be afraid to seek those answers out, and make sure you are happy with every element of it. And as we sort of mentioned, your cloud strategy really does need to reflect this. So I'm going to open up to any more questions now about the second half of the webinar, or indeed any other element of the season. So if you have got any questions, please just pop them up on the screen. Whilst I'm just waiting to see if there's any of those, as I mentioned, I hope you've enjoyed the webinar and the series we've put together here. If you do have any questions for me after this, please feel free to drop me an email. My details are on screen, or indeed feel free to follow me on Twitter, where I will make announcements about future webinars. If you want to have slides of this presentation or any other presentations in the series, please drop me an email. I'll be happy to pop them over to you. And we can also send you over a white paper from our marketing department, recommendations and considerations for companies transitioning to the cloud. It's quite a good read, so if you want a copy of that, please just pop me an email and I'll get that sent over to you. Doesn't look like we've got any more questions, I don't think. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today, and for those of you who've been with us throughout the whole series, and I look forward to welcoming you to more of our webinars in the future.